The 2021 Town Memorial Blitz tournament took place in Riga right after the Chess.com FIDE Grand Swiss. And in this round, Levon Aronian faced off against Haik Martirosyan, and we had a London and Eric Rosen fans go wild. If you listen closely, you can hear them partying hard in whatever random college dormitory they are tuning in from. Just kidding, but it did transpose into a Benoni from a London. A6, of course, threatens the move pawn to b5, and so Levon puts the kibosh on that idea. A4, the very typical response to such a maneuver. G6, E4, and bishop to G7, we're reaching a Benoni structure where all the points of tension will be around the extended white pawns. Here you see the pawn on D5. Eventually black tries for things like E6. And then the white pawn on A4. Black usually doesn't give up on his goal to play for B5. So just mark that, circle those dates on your calendar. We will get back to those pawn structural ideas later on. Natural developing moves here and the exchange of the knight on F3 for Haik means that black will have control over the E5 square. Getting rid of that light square bishop is often helpful for black in these structures because otherwise, if you close your eyes and visualize, that bishop is just sitting on C8. With that bishop gone, Martirosyan has a little bit more space on the queen side, and that space is used for maneuvers like you see here. A knight retreating to E8, trying to come back around to the square of C7, as I said, to perhaps support both a B5 pawn advance and a pawn to E6 advance. These are the typical Benoni ideas. Now, white has the bishop pair here, so it's not that white is unhappy if the position slowly becomes open. And so usually the way that white approaches it is with very patient, mature ideas like Levon just showed there. Just because your bishop went to E2 and took on F3 doesn't mean that that's a happy diagonal for that bishop. And experience is about recognizing not just how to play the position with where your pieces are, but always asking and challenging and being skeptical as to whether or not the pieces are on their best squares. So the bishop coming back to this F1 A6 diagonal you're going to see proves super critical for white in a lot of these long-term Benoni positions. Martirosyan does indeed bring the knight to C7, fulfilling the prophecy I laid out before. But Levon plays bishop to H6, again, a very nice idea to get rid of that monstrous thing on G7. The dark squares are fun for black when the diagonals are open. Here comes rook to B8. As we said, a good Benoni player never gives up on the ideas of B5 and E6. Sometimes you have to be patient, sometimes you have to maneuver, but Martirosyan is playing a position that is still roughly level at this point, maybe a small edge for white, but typical in a Benoni to be a little bit worse according to the computer when you have less space in these types of positions. Now that move, Rook A3, is a lot of fun. You already start to look at the king side. You imagine that rook just hopping all the way over to the H-file, taking on G7. The queen comes into H6 and Bob's your uncle on H7. Good old-fashioned family fun would be had for Levon Aronian if that was the case. But after B5, you've got some big decisions to make. Knight to D1 is natural, not just because it opens up the third rank, but stops the move B4 that was coming to fork the rook and the knight. But it still doesn't mean you've solved exactly what you want to do with black's queenside space advantage. I like this move knight F6 from Haik because the deed has been done, if you will, right? The knights served their purpose, helping make sure that you could expand and gain space on the queen side. Now you want to make sure that nothing on that H-file gets out of control, so the knight comes back to F6 to guard H7. Bishop F1, of course, protected the pawn on E4. If you notice, the rook on E1 unleashed to defend the threat of knight takes E4. And rook to E8 officially threatens, if black wants to keep his bishop. So Levon says, no thank you, I'll take that guy before you back it up to H8. And here comes rook to H3 with the threat of queen to H6 check. H5 by Martirosyan, and you can already see that he's fought his way back into this game after having less space, after being in a Benoni where optically you sort of look worse. Black's position is very solid. This is why a lot of people like the Benoni, especially in blitz and rapid time controls. Without a lot of time on the clock, white doesn't often convert on the space advantage like a computer would, and so you already see the position is opening up a little bit for black, but this is a critical moment, and he blew it. Rook takes E6 was not the right idea. You have to take with the knight there so that you can immediately get the move pawn to D5 next. After rook to E3, D5 is not possible anymore. White can take it, and there's too many pieces on the E-file. But after queen to E7, you're still not in a position to get D5. After F3, if D5 is played, white will take once, and knight F takes D5, white will take on E6, destroying black's structure. So Haik continues to prepare it, but it's one move too slow because now this move C4 is holding back the D5 square forevermore. B takes C4 would allow bishop takes C4, attacking the rook on E6 and renewing the pressure on the A6 pawn. But if you don't take C4, you're never going to get D5. So suddenly, just that small slip where Haik had really played a very effective Benoni. If I don't say so myself, I was liking the direction for black, but taking on e6 with the rook rather than with the knight, and missing the opportunity to fully bring liberation to his pieces, now has him in a position where the d6 pawn is a terrible weakness. You see that little shuffle there from Levon? That's the shoulder shuffle of a guy who's been here before. It says, all right, I got through the worst against this youngster from my hometown country, and now I'm going to make sure he knows that he will never free his position again. The d6 pawn is forever my target. And white is choosing between pleasant choices. Keep the structure as is, play moves like rook e to d1, or even pawn to g3 just to prevent knight f4. But knight to d5 also makes a lot of sense here for white to make sure that black can't get knight to f4. Levon's going to take a moment to think about it, as he should. But the main point is that white is structurally in control here. And if you bring a piece to d5 after the exchange, I assume you would take with the c-pawn and you would reopen the bishop on f1, as that guy has been the spy kind of lurking, right? The ninja waiting in the wing for his chance to explode on the a6 pawn. You could argue, if we backed all the way up, that the move pawn to a5 from Levon when he played it was a bit superficial. It was also risky because the a5 pawn in another life is the biggest weakness for white, right? Imagine that black queen on c7 and that pawn on a5 is falling. But now you have to play knight d4 because otherwise you're backing up into passivity, and I don't think you have to ask Levon twice about what the right thing to do is here. He's looking at that pony, and he's taking that pony, right? Capture twice on d4. He is a what do you say? A descendant of the Tigran Petrosian, the first and only Armenian world champion. Tigran Petrosian, of course, coined the let's sacrifice the exchange and play with compensation. Now you have a decision to take pawns or grab the c-file. That is how you win things at the highest level of chess. You don't get greedy, and you don't get impatient by proving your compensation. You remember that chess is about square control more than it is material. We like material because more powerful pieces can control more squares, but don't ever forget the goal is to control squares, to both improve your pieces and their power and to limit your opponent's activity. Rook to c1 is the kind of move you really want to give to your students and ask them what the best, most disciplined approach is. Now those pawns are going to fall. a6 falls first. The b4 pawn is under the gaze of the queen. You can already see that this position is just getting harder and harder for Martirosyan, which is why he now is lashing out with moves like f5. Probably the move king h8 for black a few moves ago wasn't as good as something like queen f6, unpinning the rook on e5. But he didn't unpin the rook. Now he's dealing with a very powerful bishop on e4, a very powerful queen, a dominant rook on the c-file, a b4 pawn that is still falling. You better take a5, young man, before it's too late. Indeed, he does. If you allowed the pawn to go to a6, it would have been all over Red Rover. Send the white pawn over, become a new queen on a8, right, and go disco dancing later in the night. Levon looks like he could go disco dancing later. That's like I could be serious, right? It's both mature, going to work, but also you could throw down in the club pretty quickly with that outfit. All right, d6 is falling, and with it, we're heading to an endgame. On the one hand, you feel good when you're down the exchange and your king is open because you don't want to get checkmated if you're Martirosyan. But the problem is white just has way too many pawns here. A bishop on e4 and count them, 3 pawns for the exchange. Levon taking his time before pushing the b-pawn. You can see that Martirosyan is under a little bit more time pressure. But after rook h6, Levon again pleasantly choosing, do I check and trade rooks or do I advance my pawns a little bit further first? I think it's smart to now probably trade rooks because then you can take g4. Yeah, once you take if you had taken g4 first, rook e1 would have won the bishop for Martirosyan. But trading rooks, then taking g4 now puts white in a 4-pawn up exchange sacrifice. That is a lot of pawns. Wow, and the g2 pawn is protected. That's got to hurt. It hurts when you make a threat that isn't a threat, right? You play rook to d2 to hit the g2 pawn and realize you weren't even threatening anything. At least in this world, you do pick up the b pawn, but the g6 pawn is running. The d6 pawn will join the party the moment that rook leaves the 6th rank. Here it comes, d6 check, king f8. White probably plays king f6 first. The king is guarded from checks on the f-file. What a beautiful bishop there. How do you deal with d7 and g7 at the same time? You don't. You take g2 to stop g7, but on d7, you take a good look at the clock, you take a good look at your old Uncle Levon, say thanks for paving the way for all of us here in this Armenian chess world. We love everything you've done, and good luck there representing the USA flag in the future, buddy. I'm pretty sure that's what he said to his buddy right there. And if you want to say anything great about this video, leave a comment down below. Of course, you can also click on one of the many other videos that have been featured before your eyes, especially if you like these Blitz commentary videos. Click on another one and check out more commentary from either Danya Naroditsky or myself. We'll see you around on Chess.com.